I'm paraphrasing. That inspired me after the session to go, I think we lost the forest for the trees there. So I want to come back and just say it as simply as I can. And so that's what you've got as a handout. This is also in D2L, but I thought rather than put it up here and read it out to you, I'd give it to you so you can have it in your hands, read it out that way. But so I'm just what I tried to do in that, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but what I tried to do in that handout is just briefly, it's not that brief, it's 6 pages, but briefly and without doing a lot of exegesis, just state what I think Hegel is claiming about the account that he's giving of each of those two strata of objectivity, so both mechanism and chemism, just the account of it. So that's what you see at first. Then you see me try to say, well, here's what the logical structure underlying that is, as Hegel does it. He roughly does this kind of division. He starts off with the account, but he'll also interject the logical stuff. But usually he keeps the logical stuff for the transition at the ends. That's why that crazy, 3 different syllogisms, the triad of syllogisms, as he says it, at both the end of mechanism, there's another one at the end of chemism. That's why that comes there. But I think it's important just to sort of get the picture of what he's claiming first, and then see if you can, if the logical structure is what it does what it should do, which is hopefully illuminate what's already been described and show you what the processes undergirding that, the ontological processes undergirding that are. As I said last time, I just want to reiterate it again today. Hegel's not describing a mechanical world and then there's a chemical world over here. And he's also not, so it's just one world, one set of objects. So you'll see me go back to that line. So that's why you see in this description where I keep saying, objects qua mechanical, because I just think of it, it's one set of objects. He's talking about them at the mechanical dimension, but they also have a chemical dimension. Same set of objects, right? Not two different worlds. So that's one thing to say about it. But also he's not trying to do, and this is, opens up into a broader discussion that we had a little bit last time, but I don't want to get too far lost in this because it really takes us into other domains than the logic itself. And that is, he's really not trying to give you a scientific account in the natural scientific sense. He's not trying to give you a natural scientific account of mechanism, right? Because as he says, all of his examples, right, are on the one hand, they'll be about the solar system, and then the next sense, they're about, the state, right? So he's mixing up his illustrations because he wants to say to you, I'm giving you an account at such a fundamental, ontological, abstract, formal level that it applies just as much to solar systems as it does to states. So, it gets both something that's, in his terms, a natural event, a natural phenomena, and a spiritual phenomena on his terms. It captures both of them. He does the same thing with chemism, right? The favorite thing that people usually go in chemism and say, chemism and get is that, look, he's not only talking about chemical reactions and, standard sort of stuff like that. So he is talking about the ontological underpinnings of that, but he's also talking about love, right? Because he thinks that that's also, so again, a natural phenomenon, and love for him falls under spiritual phenomenon. So that as well, he wants to talk about both of them. So I take those illustrations to remind us that he's actually not trying to give what we would call natural scientific or even a social scientific account of those phenomena, mechanism and chemism. He's trying to give the ontological underpinnings of all of that. That's why his mechanism, and whatever chemism is, what nobody outside of Hegel world talks about the chemism of the world. And one of the commentators I looked at several weeks ago reminded me and said, Hegel's the only one who thinks there's a chemical structure to the world. Not that there's not chemical processes out there. Of course, tons of people think that. This is not unique. But he literally thinks that chemism is that there's a structure out there called the chemical world that you could talk about it, or chemical strata. You could talk about it in those terms. Well, these things are not descriptions of the material world. These are accounts, logical accounts of the underpinnings of what that world is at the ontological level, at that fundamental level, that then get expressed naturally and spiritually in these higher forms. But those are higher forms. All right. So if that makes a little bit of sense, I'll come to the mechanism, chemism stuff in just a minute, because I want to work particularly up at the end of the chemism analysis, where there are those 3 syllogisms at the end of that. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the transition over into teleology, how that's supposed to work. And then we'll do as much of teleology as we can get done today. That'll be effective. And then if we can figure out how teleology, external purposiveness necessarily entails the life process, which is what we'll talk about beginning next week, and the idea, then we'll have done good work. All right. Questions for me, issues, problems before we get going? I've said enough already. So I just want to remind us of a couple of things. One of them is, and this is all by way of review, so nothing new in what I'm about to say at all. I think it's always important to go back and say, look, what is objectivity? Right? What is this thing he's talking about called objectivity? And one of the places to go to see what he means by objectivity is to see about this transition from syllogistic structures into objectivity itself. So remember, he says there that the syllogism is, that the disjunctive syllogism in particular, and I'm not about to go on another rant about the disjunctive syllogism, you've heard me enough, but Hegel comes back to it, so we will when he does. The disjunctive syllogism, he says, is the conclusion, right? It actually fulfills everything a syllogism is supposed to be, because the mediating and the mediated here fall away. That distinction falls away. So the form and the content distinction falls away. Now, I take that has, I've said this before, has two senses. We'll focus on the latter of the two, but it has two senses. The second sense is the one that's more important for our purposes in answering the question, what does he mean by objectivity? But he says it has two senses. In one sense, he just says, look, in all the other preceding syllogistic forms, you could back that out and say, in all the other judgment forms and all the other conceptual determination forms, right? So all of that stuff, because the syllogism is the truth of all of those. The disjunctive syllogism is different than all those, because in the disjunctive syllogism, unlike in all the preceding ones, the middle term, so unlike the copula in judgment, unlike particularization in the conceptual determination forms, he says here it's not distinct from the two moments that it creates, the universality and singularity, right? It's the middle term is not separate from, particularity and singularity. It's not separable from them. Here, the middle term is universality, but universality thought as genus, where genus specifies itself, and therefore it just is particularity. And because it is particularity, it therefore is singularity. So in the disjunctive syllogistic form, you could say in the reflection, the syllogisms of necessity forms, all three of them, categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. All of those are ultimately the completion of, the fulfillment of what that process was always about, and therefore it doesn't have moments separable anymore. They're all part and parcel of one thing. This flow of universality particularizing itself into singularity. Which you could say, well, we already had that in the conceptual determinations. We absolutely did, but remember that culminates in singularity. So the emphasis there is more on singularity, and the culmination of it, both completes itself there, comes back to itself, as he says, but it also falls apart there, right? That claim that he makes. The falling apart, of course, led us into judgment, which is trying to bring the two moments together, the subject and the predicate. The copula is the key notion there, not the culmination, but the copula itself. But then the copula is shown to be itself already have implied within it, or embedded within it, syllogistic structures. So the syllogisms are the ultimate way of understanding the movement or the process of the concept itself. So the disjunctive syllogism is the completion of that process. It's the complete and utter account of what that, it's the formal account of what that is in and of itself. So that's what I would call the internal sense of that claim, right? It's the end of all the subjective forms, because there can't be any more subjective forms. After that, it completes and fulfills them all. But then there's not only this internal sense, just internal to subjective, formal logic sense of it, but he also wants to say there's an external sense in which, remember, subjective here had meant not personal subjectivity, not transcendental subjectivity, not God subjectivity, but formal, right? Formal in the sense distinct from the real. Objectivity is the real concept, he says. The subjectivity chapter is the formal concept. And here the form has now not only been shown to be complete unto itself. That's what the disjunctive syllogism does. It gives the full account of what that form is. But insofar as it's the full account, then the form that the formal concept is, these formal determinations, also are not separable from the content itself. They are fully and completely what the concept is objectively, not just subjectively, but objectively as well. There's no separation, there's no separability at that moment between the form, the logical form, and the content, which is the concept process itself. There's no separability between the two. So at that point, Hegel says, it's right at the end of the subjectivity chapter, not only have we reached the end of all logical forms, but we've also gained or won reality. It's kind of a stunning claim, right? We're no longer formalistic, that's what he's saying, right? Because we've reached the culmination of what all formal structures have shown about the movement of the concept, the process of the concept, then we actually can't be distinct from that process itself. We must have the process itself in view. That's what he means by it's now one, that's his term for it, reality. So that means it's objective. Right? There's not some formal thing over here we call formal logic and its conceptual determinations, its judgment forms, or its syllogistic forms. Those have entailed actually that they can't be separable from reality itself. So that's why he says now, to put it in the language he uses earlier when he's talking about the broad relationships of the various parts to one another, this is where subjectivity entails objectivity. The formal concept entails the real concept. And this is where he says, and I want to push this language because he comes back to it again at the end of the Chemism chapter and again in the teleology chapter, which we are talking about today. He says this is the moment where the concept, which had been front and center, right? We've been trying to get its conceptual determinations, universality, particularity, singularity. We looked at it in the judgment forms, looked at that in syllogistic forms. This is where that concept is submerged, his language, sunk into objectivity. So it's one objectivity, that's the claim, right? But in winning it, it's become immersed in it. And that's a carefully chosen term. He comes back to it repeatedly, variations on the German term here. Because what he thinks is going on here is that at first we're dealing with objectivity, as he says, in and for itself, just as it stands on its own, not in relationship to anything else, just as it is on its own. And that's what mechanism and chemism both are talking about. They're talking about the nature of reality at the ontological level without any relation to anything else. So this is not what objectivity is for a consciousness. This is not what, that would be a phenomenology, right? Not doing that. This is not what objectivity is qua natural determinations, that being the philosophy of nature. It's not what it is spiritually, that's being the philosophy of spirit. Here we're dealing it purely on its logical formal structure, and that logical formal structure has now proven to be just what that objectivity is itself. So as I said several times, and I'm trying to pay off just a little bit on this in the handout I've given you, I think you could say that with the objectivity chapter, he's coming back and saying, okay, one more time through being, one more time through essence, because now we need to go back and look at them not from the logic of being in terms of its quality, quantity, measure, and we don't need to look at essence in terms of the relations and modal, the relations and modal structures that it has. Wonderful as those are all true. But now we need to look at them in terms of the process of the concept as it informs, engenders, and produces them. So the objectivity chapter is, for lack of a better terminology, is Hegel's account of what being and essence are when understood from the concept. If the concept is the truth of being and essence, here's what being and essence are at the most fundamental level in terms of the movement of the concept itself, the process of the concept. But that only tells us where we start from. So that objectivity in and for itself is like, here's the way things are in and for themselves. Here's the way they stand on their own. So whenever Hegel uses that in and for itself language, he's thinking about something standing without any dependency on anything else. So there's nothing outside of objectivity. There's nothing other than objectivity. There just is objectivity itself. And the concept is submerged in objectivity, but it's immanent. It's not over against it. It's not outside it. It's not above it. It's not transcendent. None of those kinds of extraneous language we could use for this. It's not exterior to it. What? So it's within it itself. That's objectivity in and for itself. I'm pushing that because, as we know, remember this, right? Hegel draws a distinction very early on before he really gets going in the chapter, and he tells you, as Hegel will tell you, so in not terribly clear language, but I do think he is saying that this chapter revolves around a distinction between objectivity in and for itself and immediate existence. Objectivity is immediate existence. That is to say, as it exists for something else. So objectivity in and for itself as it is on its own. That's chemism and mechanism and chemism. The concept is buried, submerged in objectivity in and for itself, in mechanism and chemism. But we do see, this is what I'm going to try to point out and work on in just a moment. We do see at the end of chemism, where he literally uses this language, prepared it earlier, right? That's why this is set up this way. That the concept steps out over against. Steps out over against what? Objectivity. It steps out over against objectivity. It becomes explicit in a way at the end of chemism, the account of chemism, and now stands in relationship to, it stands over and against, in relationship to objectivity. Here the concept has emerged from its submergence. And that means that objectivity is no longer in and for itself, doesn't stand on its own. It stands for the sake of, it's beholden to, use that kind of language, the concept. Hence, a discussion of teleology as extrinsic teleology, what you read for today, as instrumentality, is another way of putting it. He says at one point, we'll complicate these analyses, but at least the beginning of it, he says, this is where the concept makes use of objectivity. It sets the agenda. It's what the concept sets the agenda for the usage it will make of, we could say broadly, mechanistic and chemistic strata of objectivity. But now objectivity is no longer in and for itself. It's an immediate existence for the sake of the concept. Now, as I said last time, that's for 99% of the teleology chapter. That's what he's talking about. And he will therefore talk about how the concept and its relationship to objectivity is a relationship of violence, Gewalt, right? It's making use of it. So he says that's not Macht. That's not a power that's expressing causally itself, manifesting itself in and through, immanently within objectivity itself. It's one that's actually taking it over, controlling it, making use of it. This is where he uses this famous line that he's oftentimes appealed to. People say they don't appeal to it in the logic, they're talking about it out of the philosophy of history. But he has this notion of the cunning of reason. The cunning of reason. The List der Vernunft. The cunning of reason. This is reason making use, the concept, making use of something that is itself not aware of the uses to which it's being put. So it's a purely instrumental tool usage way of formulating the relationship between the concept and objectivity. Now objectivity now not in and for itself, but objectivity as the immediate existence for the usage of the concept itself. Now, as I said, for 99% of the teleology chapter, which we'll go back and look through, and there's all sorts of issues and problems that arise there, and we'll talk about those as we go through it. But his ultimate claim is that the only way that works, the only way that objectivity as immediate existence can be used by the concept, can be there for the sake of the concept, extrinsic purposiveness. The only way that works is if it already is amenable, malleable, penetrable, the language he uses, by the concept. And that means it's already got to be, these are my terms, not Hegel's, ripe and ready for the usage. And the only way it can be ripe and ready for the usage is if it's already preformed in accordance with the concept itself. So the concept's violence, initially, not ultimately, can't be an invasion from without, like it's initially displayed, like it's initially portrayed. It initially looks like Gewalt, it looks like violence, like overtaking and making use of something. The concept is making use of something that is outside and beyond it. It's exactly how Hegel portrays it. I don't want to mischaracterize that. It's exactly what he's doing. But his argument hinges on the claim that the only way that's possible, that that's successful, that the means is able to be used by the process to achieve its end, Zweck. The only way that works is if the means is already informed by, constituted by, produced by the Zweck beginning, which is of course the argument of the rest of the chapter. Preceding parts of the chapter, the mechanical and the chemical dimensions of objectivity were generated by the concept. We'll talk about how in the case when we get there. But it's because of that that we must see now that this violent usage of the concept, the concept's usage of objectivity as immediate existence, is ultimately going to prove out to be something deeper. It's going to prove out to be that the concept has to be thought not as over against objectivity, but as within, immanent within objectivity itself. And you'll say, well, wait a minute. That was true in mechanism and chemism. True, it was immanent. But there it was buried. In teleology, what we demonstrate, remember he said this, that, talking about the overview of the chapter, he says, we have to show that this is not only the movement from formal to real, from subjectivity to objectivity, but we have to show that in objectivity, the concept is submerged there in mechanism and chemism. And then in the moment of chemism, it emerges, it steps out from that submergence, that buriedness in objectivity in for itself. Now objectivity becomes immediate existence. It makes use of it. But he says, it's got to step out. Okay, fine, it's done that. But Hegel then says it has to, through that same process, demonstrate that it's free. It wasn't free in mechanism. In fact, its name there appropriately was the law of necessity. And it wasn't free in chemism. There, it's an activating principle. Come back and talk about it. But it doesn't give itself its own determinations, which is what Hegel means clearly here. By free, it's not self-generating. It's not self-causing. So something about the transition from extrinsic teleology, extrinsic purposiveness, which is what he's talking about in the teleology chapter, over to intrinsic purposiveness, intrinsic teleology, which is what the life process is going to be in the first chapter of the idea section. That's got to be about this freedom. That's got to be about this self-causing and how that works. Life is the name for that. Life is the name for that. It'll have more than that, obviously. It'll have cognition, volition, all sorts of other stuff. But right now, life will be the name for that process now, where the concept is not only subjective nor simply objective, but is a objective concept. It's now a free concept. He'll also call that an adequate concept. The concept now fully shown to be that from which and by which objectivity is what it is. So it's adequate, it's material truth, right? The objectivity now has been shown to be what it is by being the embodiment of the concept, the expression of the concept itself, the manifestation, used the term used earlier in the logic of the concept. So that's overview. Does that make a little bit of sense, sort of roughly where we're at? Yeah, I'm here.
So if I'm getting this right, the collapse between the traditional distinction between matter and form that we see in Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
In Aristotle's critique of Plato.
Yeah.
I can follow that Hegel acknowledges Aristotle's contribution on the fact that matter has a sort of passive receptivity, so that eidos formulates itself. But, does Hegel's contribution, apart from Aristotle, in the formulation of material sort of adequateness, also does it make it collapse not only the distinction between matter and form, but also the idea of receptivity and what's the opposite of it?
Activity.
Activity. Also, the concept makes this activity, not only the distinction between matter and form, but the activity itself, it becomes blue.
Yeah.
Is it the case?
Yeah. So let me step back a couple of steps in your account there. So I think. So I'm introducing the terminology of form and matter. I think it captures what's going on here roughly well, not perfectly well, but roughly well. And so here's what I want to worry about in what you're saying, because here's where it's roughly too rough in the capturing of it. My mistake. Go back to the line about we've reached the end of all formal determinations in the destructive syllogism. Hegel's claim at that point is that not only is that formalism complete unto itself, but that formalism entails objectivity. That's the claim. That once you've reached that moment, that there is no distinction between the mediating and the mediated. Right? So no difference between the mediating form and the mediated content. Well, what's the content here? Well, the content here is not matter, which is more the view you get in Aristotle. It is the movement or the process of the concept itself. So already we're in a kind of different space than the Aristotelian, classic Aristotelian space. Aristotle's much more interesting than what I'm about to say. But the Aristotelian model that says roughly, look, what we do when we manufacture products is what's going on in the world as a whole, right? We impose form on recalcitrant matter until it's no longer recalcitrant. It has to be receptive to what you're talking about. But Hegel's claim is that already the materiality that we're talking about, if we want to use that term for this, I'm hesitant because that's better placed in the philosophy of nature for Hegel. But I'm the one to introduce it, so blame me. If we're going to talk about the content, to do form content, then Hegel's claim is that the form entails the content. Not that the content stands outside the form and bears it, but it actually is what the form is itself. So the form is engendering of content. An idea I don't think you'll find anywhere in the Aristotelian corpus. That's at least my view. I can be wrong. That's right. So this goes to your other question, right? About, okay, let's go to so that's the beginning of the objectivity chapter. So already we're not talking about matter in the standard way we've historically, traditional, Aristotelian and otherwise, ways in which we thought about matter and form relationship. Here we're thinking about the formal as already engendering the materiality, if we will, the content. It engenders it mechanistically, it engenders it chemistically. So, that's how that's being engendered. And it's only with the chemical determination, or the chemistic determination of it, that we get something like the concept stands over against, for reasons that we'll look at, over against this content that it has produced, mechanical and chemical strength. And so there's where your question comes in back in again, right? So, okay, I said, rightly, and this is the way Hegel describes it, the only way that the material, that the content, the mechanistic and chemistic objectivity can be a means for the fulfillment of the Zweck, the purpose, the end that is concept, is if it's amenable, malleable, penetrable by the concept. And that sets up this kind of, as I said, violent, Gewalt, overtaking of the content by the form. But notice Hegel's argument there is not that the form just has to be malleable, which is Aristotle's. Right? It has to be receptive to, right? So this is like the lesson of the Cora from Timaeus, right? It has to be welcoming to the kinds of formal impositions that are going to be laid down upon it. And so Aristotle just wants to say, well, it's got a kind of potentiality for these forms to be actual life in it. Otherwise, you couldn't do it, right? You can't make statues out of water, right? It's just you can't. That form is not able to be made in that particular material substance. Hegel's point is that, well, yes, it has to be amenable to conceptual determination by the movement of the concept, but it is that precisely because it was always already preformed by the concept. So it's not like the concept has to find a welcoming home for its determinations in something that is completely and wholly other than it. But it's what turns out to be, otherwise on pains of infinite regress, as we'll see. Right? Hegel, once again finds a spurious infinity going on either way. We'll talk about how that works in teleology. But he says on pains of that, then objectivity has to be amenable to this, and it is amenable to this. It is penetrable in this way because it's already formed by the concept itself. In mechanism, it was already formed that way. In chemism, it's already formed that way. So its layers are already layers that are generated and produced by the concept itself. That's why we can then say, oh, wow, you know what? The concept's actually not standing over against objectivity. It's immanent within objectivity itself. But now it's immanent as determining itself, causing itself in that objectivity. That's life. That's immanent teleology, no longer extrinsic teleology. See the difference there? The point I'm trying to push is that it's not about initially matter sitting outside of the concept, and it has to be informed by the concept. And for that to happen, it has to be a suitable materiality for that concept to be realized in it, which is the Aristotelian notion, fine. And that suitability there in Aristotle is thought of through the potentiality to be this. Hegel's not talking potentiality, actuality language at all. Right? The ways he discusses this straightforwardly is the only way you can get the concept to be able to use objectivity as a means to its end, its own end, in its setting for itself, is for the means to actually already have been conceptually determined. That is determined by the movement of the concept itself, which is what mechanism and chemism have shown, which is what he pulls at that point. He says, and now we remember, right? Objectivity in and for itself was always already formed by the concept. That's what we show. So he's pulling the things together. That allows him to infer then from that the concept is not extraneous to and making use of, violently overtaking objectivity. It's always already within objectivity itself, producing itself. It's a power endemic rather than a violence foisted. Is that useful at all?
Yes.
You want to follow that up?
Yes, a small one. So
Yeah.
the distinction between potency and actuality no longer holds in Hegel, but
I don't think it ever held in Hegel, frankly. I don't know where it is.
what about enteleia? That the work was already there. Is it a difference between ontology, logic, or temporality?
Well, this is the problem for Hegel in dealing with the Aristotelian framework. Aristotle thinks that is all endemically temporal. Right? He's always thinking about it's a potential for something to be realized temporally successively. And Hegel's operating at a level that's not that. Right? He would say that Aristotle wants to be doing, this is very cheap, so don't please go into your Aristotle class and go, we all know, right? That Aristotle had these ambitions, but he failed. But Hegel's take on Aristotle, if you want to put it in those terms, is roughly to say he wanted to be able to do metaphysics, and he has striven better than anybody else in the history of metaphysics. But he failed. Why did he fail? Because he imported things that belong in the natural world and the spiritual world into an analysis of what he wanted to be a purely being qua being world, and in that sense, it failed. Right? It wasn't being qua being; it was being qua this particular form of being, natural being. Or organisms, right? That's the example there. Or it's a being qua being that's really about a spiritual being. That is to say, a being that we, human beings, make things, right? We're producers. And that's the model by which we understand it. So, this is one of the standard claims made about Aristotle is to say that he thinks of nature, physis, as poiesis. He thinks about it as production. And Hegel wants to say, and there's the limits of your metaphysics. It's a metaphysics of the spiritual world, maybe some of the natural world. It's not a metaphysics of being qua being. It's a special metaphysics, not a genuinely ontological. Is that?
Yes.
Now, I want to be clear, right? Because I remember I said this at a conference one time, some version close to this, at a conference one time, and one of my fellow participants at the conference immediately started quoting, right? And pulled up. We were on Zoom, right? So you could do this. He pulls up all these quotes, right, out of Aristotle, out of Hegel, praising Aristotle to the heights. Yes, right? I don't deny that. He also praised Kant. He also praised Pseudo-Dionysus. He also, he praises lots of people. Now, he heaps a lot more praise on Aristotle than he does others, so I'm not trying to get into that debate. Who does he love best? But at the end of the day, he doesn't think they're adequate to the task that they set for themselves. This is his claim. Now, whether he's right or not is another matter. But that is at least the claim. That's the critique. Does that make some sense?
Yes, thank you.
So don't walk out by saying, we now know that Aristotle's been overturned. We do know that. But anyway, we don't know that by virtue of Hegel saying it. We don't know that. All right. Other questions, comments? Please sit down, it's good. So I just want to remind you what I said, and then I'll turn to the handout, what I said last time about how I read the objectivity chapter. So I've already mentioned a little bit of this when I said, this is about coming back to the question of being and essence. The domains, we could say, of being and essence, and trying to think through those again. So I think it's wrong-headed to think about, well, he's talking about the mechanical world, and then distinct from that is this other thing called the chemical world, and how do the two relate? And then there's the teleological world, and there's one world, one set of objects. Think about it as layers. I think that's the better way of thinking about what's going on there. And if you do that, then the question that Ferry posed last time, I think is really useful. So take a look at this. Take a look at the handout now. And in trying to do this, I thought, well, look, the best thing to do is just put the message that I really want to convey out front. Those of you who are teaching, I failed at this last week, so you saw a demonstration of what it is to fail. Here, hopefully, is a demonstration of what it would look like to at least aspire to do it better. So here's putting the message I wanted you to take home out front. So here's the quote from Hegel, literally. Not often do I quote Hegel and say, isn't that clear? But here, I do think he's fairly clear. So this is page 645, lines 7 to 10 in the translation, in the German 148. He writes there, this is right at the beginning of Chemism chapter, right? So always a good place to look if you want to know what he just did, right? What he took himself to just do in the Mechanism chapter, and how he contrasts that with what he's doing now in the Chemism chapter. He says, the chemical object differentiates itself from the mechanical. I would say that's not two domains, not two worlds, but two strata. Right? He says, the chemical object differentiates itself from the mechanical, in that the latter, mechanical, is a totality indifferent to determinateness. So full stop there. Hegel's telling you what defines mechanism is its indifference to determinateness. So you could say very simply, it's all about extrinsic relations. Extrinsic relations. Objects qua mechanical are related to one another, but it doesn't make a difference to any of them that they are. That is to say, it doesn't change their nature. It doesn't matter to them in terms of what they are internally. So they're all self-sustaining, they're all independent, self-sufficient to themselves. This gets complicated, but we'll talk more about this. But that's the trees. But the forest is, when you're looking at the mechanical dimension, the mechanical strata of objectivity, you're looking at a set of objects that bear relations to one another, but those relations are wholly extrinsic. They are relations that don't matter to any of the objects that they are in those relations. And another way I'd put this is to say there are processes there. Hegel lays out mechanical processes, both formal and real mechanical processes. We'll talk about those again. But the objects at the mechanical dimension are caught up in those processes. They're not the doer of those processes. Right? So they're caught up in the processes, but they're not the agents of the processes themselves. That will change in chemism. So he says this. So in that the latter, in the mechanical dimension, is a totality indifferent to determinateness. So think extrinsic relationality. Whereas in the chemical object, so now contrasting it with chemism, the determinateness and hence the relation to others. So now he's just told you. Now, it's not that relations weren't there in mechanism, they clearly were, but now the relation to other, he says, and the mode and manner of this relation belong to its, he's talking about the chemical objects, nature. So now it's not indifferent. It's a difference, a relationality that makes a difference in all the chemical objects themselves. Well, that's going to mean that the chemical process is different as well. Whereas in mechanical process, the objects are caught up in it. In the chemical process, we'll have to figure this out, what this really means. But in the chemical process, the chemical objects, or objects qua chemical, are the agents of the process. They're the doers of the process. They're the drivers of the process. Because they are, as Hegel says, unlike objects qua mechanical, they're striving. Right? They have a striving built into them because they are inherent self-contradiction. Each object is contradiction with itself. Now, if that makes a little bit of sense, right, just a little bit of sense, then there's a distinction between mechanism and chemism. We can replay that analysis and say, oh, I've heard something like this before. It was in the logic of essence. We just made a move from difference in itself, mechanism, to diverse moments, right? There's extrinsic relations. Those relations didn't matter at the mechanical level, but now at the chemical level, they start to matter. They're opposed, that's the term he uses. Right? The objects become opposed to one another, tensed with one another, is the way he puts it, but he means by that they oppose one another. And now that opposition isn't just extrinsic, it's now matters internally. So it's a difference that is now no longer difference in itself, it's not diversity, it's not opposition, it's inherent within the objects themselves. And what does that mean? Just as we saw for any essence what it meant that the essence, here the object, is in self-contradiction. It's a contradiction with itself. It is itself, but it's not itself. So we've moved from difference in itself to diversity to opposition to contradiction at a different level, right? Now we're not talking about essences, we're talking about objects, objective objectivity and the processes that go in there. But what that means is that, just like it did for essences, that the objects at the chemical stratum are restless. They are themselves, but they're not themselves. And just like we said, essences must appear because essences are inherently contradictory. Objects qua chemical are inherently self-contradictory. By virtue of that, they strive to come together, and that striving to come together, that very same process of coming together, ultimately reaches a kind of what Hegel calls tranquil neutrality. But that striving to come together doesn't end there because that's abstract. Right? That's a resulting product. It's not the process itself. The process disrupts that that tranquil neutrality. And because it does that, because it disrupts that, it differentiates it, it derempts it, he says at one point. Because it does that, it generates those very moments themselves. Well, that means it proves to be the concept. That's what it's doing. So we can run it through in a different set of language. I'm just trying to make the same point in different layers or different frameworks. We could also say it's a movement from a mechanism. The universality is inherent in all the objects. They all bear that objectivity. What's the the universality that they all bear? Self-subsistence, right? They all want to stand on their own. That's what they are. They bear that, they inherit that. But the chemical tension means that they can't bear it within themselves. They have to bear it within something outside of them. So they're all trying to bring together what Hegel calls a negative unity. So they're all looking to be subsumed under this negative unity. But the negative unity of subsumption won't actually allow that, because it has to be, the only way that works, the only way subsumption works, remember we've learned this lesson, is through differentiation, through specification. And that's precisely what is going on in the analysis of chemism. So there is doing it through the logic of difference, doing it through the logic of universality determinations. I think you can see him replaying, because he appeals to all this language along the way. He's kind of got all this as his resource, conceptual resources now to talk about these things. And he's talking about them all together, so it's hard to remember which ones go with which and how they actually operate. But I think that's roughly how it all goes and fits together. So let's talk a little bit then and just kind of walk our way through mechanism and chemism, unless there are questions about the overview. Issues, problems? Yeah.
So this is related again to the opening of the logic and Holgate versus Pippin on whether or not the opening or the logic in general is discursive.
Yeah.
And for Pippin, it's very important that the opening to logic is a syllogism. If it's a sort of failed syllogism, for Holgate, it's very important that it's not.
Yeah.
And I bring this up again because your characterization of the objectivity chapter as a rerun of being an essence, and from the in a way from the perspective of the concept.
Yeah.
Ultimately, is there a way in which what's happening here has any stakes, even if only reflectively so, on specific moments? I use the opening logic as a sort of toy example for that, but for really any of the particular moments, but thought of from the perspective of judgments and syllogism, the concept as a whole.
So my honest answer to that is I don't know, and I'm not sure. I think there's some trivial things that can be said. They're trivial only from the perspective of having reached the objectivity chapter and looking back. So it's not nothing in the sense of trivia that way, but it's manifestly obvious by this point, I think, that what we call becoming there, what we called negation there, what we called any of those moments of differentiation, so infinitizing in the qualitative and quantitative form, in the nodal line, and the changing of the states over against the consistency of the substratum that undergirds them. All that would have to be reconceived, or let me say it this way. All of that really is, you now know what all those processes really are. Those processes are processes at one level of the mechanical processes themselves. That's what was operating there. They were operating under that description of just becoming, negation, and so forth. But now we know what the real conceptual account of that would be. I don't think that means that, to go back to the first point about the Holgate-Pippin debate, it's not saying, therefore, that, well, this is secretly a syllogism already at work, and that's what's doing the work, which is the way Pippin reads it. So it's as I'm recalling this, Pippin wants to say roughly something along the lines of, well, he is asserting immediacy, pure immediacy, but, come on, that's not really what's going on there. What's going on there is already this syllogistic structure is at work. So it's already conceptually determined. And that's what's doing the work there. It's that last bit I'm most concerned about, because the claim that that's what's doing the work there then means that it's rigged, right? It's
not imminent.
Right, that it's not an imminent unfolding from pure indeterminacy. And this is where, I think Holgate's right about that part of it, right? Is to say, well, this means that it has to be taken out of being qua being and see what that entails directly from that. Now, we will see later that it's entailing its own truth as the movement of the concept. And we can now look at the movement of the concept as it gives rise to these things. That's won by, it's earned by, it's demonstrated, justified by, only through all the steps that interceded between that beginning and where we are now. But it's not always already at work there. If that were the case, then the end is determining the beginning. Right? And the last time I checked, that's an invalid form of reasoning. Yep.
Yes.
So that's
very early on in the seminar, I brought up a potential point of disagreement between you and Holgate. One was on the phenomenology, and you addressed that one, and then one was on the retrogressive grounding thing, and we were like, I actually think we're the same on this, and I wasn't able to articulate that further. But I remember the issue I had in my head there, which is that Holgate makes a big deal. He's very repetitive about it rhetorically. The logic could stop here, but it doesn't, as it turns out. It doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's that as it turns out, because he's trying to emphasize the inability to look ahead for imminent reasoning, which makes sense. I think you agree with that.
Yeah.
But it also seems like there's a weird position in which you know that it can't stop yet at some level, at least reflectively, maybe. And especially if you're thinking of what there is now as, in some sense, grounded in what's to come.
Yeah.
And I think that helps clarify, what you just said helps clarify that you do not mean that there's something covertly at work.
Yeah.
It's
not a surreptitious usage, right? Yeah, but so the imminence thing is incredibly important to me because it's a matter of this entails that, and that's the only logical demonstrative account that can justify where we're at now. And then from the vantage point of this, we can then, Hegel doesn't, right? Let me be clear about this. I'm going to put in a couple footnotes here to try to at least indicate where it could go. Then we should be able to say, well, here's what that means, reflectively now from the vantage point of the retrogressive ground of that, namely the concept vis-a-vis essence and being, what that would mean for that. But Hegel doesn't actually go back and do that. And he's not surreptitiously doing that already in any of those accounts, right? So I always hate these, I always feel like I'm being had, and I'm sure we all do, when someone tells us, well, there's this moment in the logic or whatever, in this movement of this argument, and it works this way, but secretly it really works because of this unacknowledged premise, right? This unacknowledged argument that's really going on here in the concept, right? Oh, well, there we go. It doesn't solve a damn thing. Right? It really doesn't solve anything. It just basically punts on the whole ability to say this is an imminent account. But once you've reached this stage, you ought to be able to look back at the prior stages and say, oh, here's what that means for them. That's what I'm suggesting, at least, that Hegel provides you the rudiments for in the objectivity chapter. Is that useful?
That's
good. Thank you. Other questions? All right, then take a look with me at the handout I gave you. Look under account, the mechanical object. So the mechanical stratum of objectivity, that is qua being in and for itself, so we're talking in that dimension of objectivity, is comprised of a plurality of objects. So, I thought this was a good place to drop this in, right? So look at the footnote. The logic of being here is entailed here. So each object qua mechanical is real. It's got a qualitative determination. It's discrete. It's got quantitative determination, I should say. And each object, so each of these mechanical objects Hegel's talking about, is not just some matter statically in motion by virtue of, its inertia. It sits there until it gets hit by another. That's not what's going on. Hegel doesn't have that view of mechanism like we take over from Newtonian mechanical science. He's already saying that each mechanical object is a nodal line of persistently changing state, so it's already undergoing change and transformation, with a constant abiding substratum due to their inherent qualitative and quantitative infinitizing nature. So they have measure as well. So I think the right way to read the mechanism chapter is to say it's objects qua mechanical, or at least those things already going on. That's why I put it up front. Right? To say it's a plurality of these things going on. Now let's look at the mechanical stratum, look at it from the logic of the concept itself. So the objects stand in reciprocal relations with one another, but these relations are wholly extrinsic, the point I was making earlier, which is to say that the objects and the relations in which they stand do not affect and are not affected by, they are indifferent to, the internal nature of the objects so related, objects that again, qua mechanical. The objects so related thus together form an aggregate. This is where we start off in the mechanism chapter with, just an aggregate, a heap, as I said last time. We're going to come to something much more ordered with absolute mechanism and free mechanism, but we're not there yet. So it forms an aggregate or arrangement of monads in the sense of a heap of wholly self-contained ones. That's why he pulls that notion of monad over, and he likes them. And yet the objects, precisely as extrinsically related and thus indifferent to one another, cannot be wholly indifferent to one another, for they can't be. So that's what we started off with, but they can't be that. They can't be wholly indifferent to one another, for each object standing as a self-contained one, so to be what it is made possible by their relation to other objects, which are each also likewise externally determined, and so on and so on. So there's the kind of infinity born within mechanism itself. It is constantly, extrinsically related, but those extrinsic relations are actually determining in a certain sense. Objects qua mechanical are thus in a state of contradiction. They are indifferent to one another, and yet these extrinsic relations are part and parcel of what make it possible for each object to be an indifferent one. So there's already this notion of contradictions at work here, becoming endemic in chemism. Here it's an extrinsic feature. The self-containedness, I'll use that to be another term for the indifferentness, the independence of each object qua mechanical, thus results from the common unity of self-identity. They all are indifferent, right? They all are independent. That they all share as inhering, there's the inherence model of universality, inhering within them. The extrinsic relationality of objects qua mechanical is paradoxically and contradictorily precisely what is intrinsic to each object qua mechanical. So their extrinsicality is what defines them all. And their extrinsicality is that they all stand independent from one another. And paradoxically, that's what defines each one of them as an object unto itself. So they're all independent. That's what they share, right? That's what they bear with one another. That leads us to talk about then the process. We've been talking about the objects, take a look at the process. Because objects qua mechanical are at once independent, indifferent, and dependent, they're contradictions, they interact with one another. Rather than acting on their own, which is what we'll find in chemism, but rather than acting on their own, they are acted upon by other independent, indifferent objects. As such, mechanical objects are in process, they are in movement. So their extrinsic contradictoriness leads them to be in, not themselves agents of process, but in a process with respect to one another. Now, in being in process, they initially at least remain indifferent to one another. They're unaffected in their inner natures by their interactions with other indifferent objects. So this is what Hegel calls the formal mechanical process. He also calls it communication. Objects acting and reacting to one another, which results in rest, peace, equilibrium. So far, so good. But in truth, objects qua mechanical are able to be indifferent, independent, wholly self-related, only insofar as they resist these interactions. Because if they are all taken into a rest and equilibrium, then they've collapsed in their independence. So they've got to resist, react against this, drawing them all together. So that's the real mechanical process, what he calls distribution. Objects resist the power, the Macht of communication, but they are ultimately overcome or perish by its force, Gewalt, so they're ultimately overtaken by that. So as a result of these processes, objects, top of page 2 now, objects qua mechanical are not a mere aggregate. This is on the back of yours. They're not a mere aggregate. That's what we started with, right? A mere heap. Instead, they actually form an inchoate system, right? Not a fully elaborated system, but an inchoate system. The feature of self-relatedness or independence that all objects qua mechanical share is a negative unity. Negative unity is Hegel's term for an abstract universal. It's abstract because it doesn't belong to any of them. It's shared out amongst all of them, right? Each one of them it adheres. The negative unity that functions for them as a center, and this will be important to get, right? There's a center, right? And sometimes he'll speak of a central body, right? But look at it. It's a center around which the objects, which are themselves now each centers of their own subordinate peripheral objects, they're all organized as the periphery of its center. So now we don't have an aggregate, right? Now we don't have a heap. Now we've got an organized system, a system organized around a central, he'll say sometimes body, or just more often the center. Here's the kicker, though. Right? This is what moves us from mechanistic depiction of objects and processes to chemism. Yet note that the center is nothing other than its distribution to all the objects. There is no center. There's no central body. This is Hegel's point about mechanism. It's all organized around a center where there is no center. There's just a law. There's a law there. The center is the law. But the law is just the law of the process of communication and distribution. That's all it is. Everything coming together and everything being dispersed back out. So there is no central body. This isn't the solar system as we like to think of it. Right? This isn't the sun and everything is revolving around the sun, and so the sun is the center of everything. Precisely what Hegel's saying there's not. There's not a central body in that sense. There is no center. It's just a law that organizes what had initially been an aggregate into an ordered system. So now we have what he calls absolute mechanism, or because it's a law, it's free mechanism. Now, what I try to do in the logical structure section is lay out the triad of syllogisms at the end. We can talk about those if you want, but I just want you to have them here for reference. I'm not going to try to work through them in any kind of detail. It does move, I just wanted to note this one thing, it moves from inherence to induction to onus. So it moves from inherence to subsumption to another form of subsumption. So it's about those kinds of universality. Now, the key moment is that last one I already mentioned. This is on discussion of transition. And what he says about law there. Gazette's law, objective universality, which is concrete universality. He says here is the process. So law denotes a process, not a rule, not a principle that stands outside of the mechanistic relations and processes going on there, but it's a law that's endemic to it. It's the process that binds all objects qua mechanical to the center, to communication and rest, and is also the particularizing whereby each object stands into itself. It's the law of communication and distribution. It's the law that governs that wherever there is communication, there will be distribution. Wherever there's distribution, there will be communication. So in 643, let me cite this. I won't do explication of it so much, but the central point expanded inside its pure ideality by difference. That's his line that there is no center. There's only a center that is distributed, differentiated. So accordingly, this is me again now, the center is actually nothing unto itself. I think this is the best way to interpret what Hegel's saying here. There is no thing called the center. There's no body called the central body, really. It is, though he does use that language, I want to be clear, so I'm not trying to deny that he doesn't use the language, but really, you push him, what does he mean by it? He says, I mean by the center, the law. So it's not a body, it's law. And the law is nothing other than the law of the process. So it's not really anything unto itself. So the center is actually nothing unto itself. It is nothing other than the law, and the law just is the process of communication and distribution, the law of differentiation. Consequently, objects qua mechanical do not strive towards a middle point. They don't strive towards a middle point because that middle point, the center, just is their particularization, just is the law. Rather, each object now strives towards the object determinately opposed to it. So it's now defining itself over against something else. Here, the extrinsic determinations are becoming intrinsic determinations. Each object now strives towards the object determinately opposed to it. Doesn't strive towards the middle, strives against and becomes tensed with, opposed to the object that stands next to them. So that they can stand on their own. Remember, to stand on their own, they have to stand separate from the other objects. Yet do so only in and through standing opposed to each and every other object qua mechanical. Now we don't have the aggregate or the heap that we started with of pure indifference and extrinsic relations. We also don't have the absolute mechanism, free mechanism of the law-governed communication and distribution. We have that the objects themselves are opposing themselves to one another. So the relations have begun to become intrinsic rather than extrinsic. Begun to become intrinsic rather than extrinsic. He says objects as such stand in a tensed, opposed relation to one another, a difference that now makes a difference to each object, and thus each object is no longer indifferent to every other object, and thereby indifferent to itself. Objects, as far as they are mechanical, have thus proven to be objects that are chemical, opposed to one another. So here's that distinction he wants to draw. Rather than indifferent to one another, that is mechanical, and here's this line again, it's the same one I quoted at the beginning. The chemical object differentiates itself from the mechanical, and that the latter, the mechanical, is a totality indifferent to determinateness, whereas in the chemical object, the determinateness, and hence the relation to other, and the mode and manner of this relation belong to its nature. So far, so good. All by way of rehearsal, I know you read about teleology for this week, but I want you to at least have this stuff fairly fresh in your mind, because when we talk about teleology, this is going to come back. Right? This is what the pivot at the end of the teleology chapter is about. So now, still one set of objects, one world. We moved from one layer to the next layer. We moved up. You want to think about it in those terms. You can think about it reverse. You can say we moved down one level, right? Because we're ultimately going to end up with teleology. That's the truth of the object. The chemical stratum of objectivity, again, being still in and for itself here, is also comprised of a plurality of objects. And these objects stand in reciprocal relations with one another. But whereas these relations are wholly extrinsic in the mechanical stratum, here for objects qua chemical, these relations are intrinsic, the being of one, the being of the other. Objects qua chemical are tensed with respect to one another and with respect to themselves. Each bears, and this is the technical language that Hegel invokes here, an affinity for the others. So I put a footnote here and said, okay, now we're in the world of relationality, now we're in the logic of essence. So we can say that, Hegel doesn't say this, but I think it's here to be said, right? It's available to be acknowledged, that each object qua chemical is a grounded appearance. It's a grounded appearance. This is how he defines existence in logic of essence. And that bears essential relation, the part-whole relation, the force-expression relation, outer-inner. So all that's here to be talked about. He doesn't talk about it, but all that would be here to talk about now in the chemical dimension. They have modality, that is relative possibility, contingency, and actuality, and absolute contingency and necessity. And they have absolute relations, substance, accidents, cause, effect, reciprocity. Because of that intrinsic relationality, all of this now becomes part and parcel of what's going on in this dimension. So here's where the logic of essence that we talked about on its own and saw it develop and entail its own imminent development, here we can see now where that arises from. So objects qua chemical are an immanent self-contradiction. They are themselves, they're independent. They are self-subsistent totalities. He calls this the indifferent basis. They're indifferent to their relations to others still. They want to stand on their own. But also they are what they are only insofar as they are particularizations of the real genus that all objects qua chemical are. So there's that contradictory nature that was already there beginning extrinsically in the mechanical dimension. Here we now see it fully and completely within the nature, internal, intrinsically, part and parcel of each and every object qua chemical. So here's the important result of this. This is what drives really the rest of the discussion. The result of their self-contradictory nature, objects qua chemical, is that each and every object qua chemical is driven beyond itself. Hegel says at one point, each and every object qua chemical is a striving. A striving. He's not saying, right, that human beings strive after them, or there are chemical processes that exhibit striving, all that kind of. He's not making that claim. He's literally saying, because they're self-contradictory, they strive to transcend themselves. They strive to other themselves, to become other than themselves. So they strive to transcend themselves. As such, objects qua chemical are not just, as they were qua chemical, caught up in a process. Rather, they are, each one of them, themselves processes that strive to actualize the concept that each one bears within itself. Now, I want to stop there and make sure everybody's okay, because what we're about to do is the messy stuff out of the chemism chapter. That's all set up, right, for the rest of the incredibly messy stuff in the rest of the chemism chapter. We good? Questions about where we are up to that point? All right, let me give you the simplified version of the chemism chapter. This is what you get in the encyclopedia logic version. Because in encyclopedia logic, Hegel basically, I'm paraphrasing, in one paragraph says this. There are two chemical processes. One is they are joined together in a neutral result, and then they're disrupted and torn asunder from that. that's the chemical process. That's all you need to know. Good night, goodbye, we're done. He goes into much more torturous, careful, minute analysis of it here in the Greater Logic. So if you look at the corresponding passages in the Encyclopedia Logic, doesn't matter if you're looking at the 1817, 1827, or 1830 edition of the Encyclopedia. He does a very short version of it there, and I remember looking at several commentators, and a lot of points commentators give up, right? So, commentators are supposed to be commenting on each one of the passages as it comes up. And a lot of the commentators, even on the Greater Logic, will say, okay, I'm going to revert back to the Encyclopedia Logic version to talk about this because it's too incredibly difficult. I'm not clear that I have a better handle on it than that, right? So I don't want to make claims other than what you're about to see. But I do think it's important to not just say that there's two processes, one that bring everything together and one that throws everything apart. That's true, right? So I don't want to deny that, right? The chemical process itself is a process of putting things together, bringing things together, and separating them back out. That's absolutely the case. But the separating back out is not just like distribution was in the mechanical process. It's not just, okay, everything shares out in universality and hairs and all these things. You're all self-subsistent. Here, as you can imagine, the analog of distribution in the chemical domain, the analog of it here is not simply we'll reestablish that everything is differentiated from one another. The differentiation is going to be a creative differentiation. It's going to be what produces them. That's the difference. So it's important to kind of go through this step by step. All right, so we good? Any questions about this? So acknowledging the proviso I just gave you, which is the more difficult stuff. Let's take some baby steps on our way through there. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's why you only get a sentence and another sentence rather than paragraphs. So objects qua chemical are thus defined by their striving to overcome their one-sidedness and establish the objectivity of the concept that each bears within itself. So now each object is the concept, but it's striving to realize that concept because that concept is not simply itself. It's everything that exists. So it's striving to overcome its own self-subsistence at the same moment it's trying to be self-subsistent. There's the contradiction that's born within it. So by virtue of this striving, the tensed or oppositional affinity that each object possesses for all the other objects draws them all together. There's the affinity doing the work of drawing them all together. Now that's the chemical analog of communication in the mechanical sphere, right? This is drawing everything together. But here we're drawing them together not because they're caught up in a process of communication, but because they're doing this of themselves. They're the agents of the process themselves. Each object qua chemical is doing this of itself. Now each object qua chemical is striving in consequently he says only an external violence. So here's the role of Gestalt here. Only external violence, a catalyst, can hold them separate and distinct from one another, can hold them apart. Now, each object qua chemical is striving inherently to posit the concept itself, which each bears within itself as part of its defining contradiction. But at this stage, this unity, that universality, which they all share, can only be a formal element. So formal element, oh, that's like the universal has become a class. It's no longer something that's property features of each object. It's something that all the objects bear, right? Because they bear it, they're subsumable within it. So now we've got this common element that they all can be subsumed within. It's a class. He calls this a formal element that concretely exists distinct from them. You could also hear that as, and could subsume them under it. I quoted this because I thought it was useful. The element of communication, so here's communication now thought at the chemical level. Now, it's really originally a mechanical process. Chemical level, where this is the element of communication. He says, wherein they enter into external community with each other. External community with each other, I think, is a way of expressing this notion of they're all subsumed under a class. They're all members of this class concept called self-subsistence, which none of them are now. Coming together in this element, objects qua chemical, on the one hand, communicate with one another in a tranquil coming together. So this is like the peaceful equilibrium at the mechanical level. Here you see it again at the chemical level, but now it's driven by the objects themselves, not by the process that is extrinsic to them. So at this point, the only difference that we're talking about between the mechanical and the chemical is chemical objects drive the chemical process themselves, and that drives them into a rest and equilibrium, a harmony with one another. Whereas in the mechanical, they were driven there by something that's extrinsic to them. The process, mechanical process of communication was extrinsic to them. He says, they communicate with one another in a tranquil coming together. On the other hand, this is a negative relating, and as such, the real differences between objects qua chemical are dissolved. So a negative relating always means for Hegel an abstract relating. It doesn't preserve their differences. It subsumes, dissolves their differences. The product of this process is thus a, Hegel's term, tranquil neutrality. So here we're back to peace and rest and equilibrium at the chemical level. So again, the result is not that radically different between the mechanical process of communication and the chemical process of communication. The real main difference is the driver of it, right? The driver at the mechanical level was extrinsic. Here the driver is intrinsic to the objects themselves. The result is roughly the same. It's a rest, peace, equilibrium, tranquil neutrality. So just to push that last bit, because it's going to become the real pivot line of the analysis as far as I can tell. The chemical process is thereby extinguished. Done, it's over. And the contradiction between the concept and its reality, which has been, in each object itself, between what Hegel calls the base and the genus or catalyst, is resolved. The oppositional tension between the objects qua chemical is reduced, you could read that as subsumed, under to a unity. Make some sense? If I lose you there, I've lost you, so I don't want to lose you there. That at least makes some sense. So look at the top of page 5. And frankly, I don't want to oversell this. I don't want to be too hyperbolic. I'm about to be hyperbolic, is what that means, right? This is the argument, right? If this works, then the argument from chemism to teleology works. Maybe even the whole chapter works, because this is what it all hinges on, as I'll go on to try to argue. But look at what he says. But the chemical process itself is not reducible to the neutral product. Now, that's a key premise as far as I can tell, right? That the process can't be reduced to what is produced. The process cannot be the chemical process of communication, which is driven by the objects striving out of their own self-contradiction to realize the concept. And the best concept they could realize is what? A negative unity, a tranquil result, neutrality. But Hegel's claim is that the process can't be reduced to, can't be captured, can't be subsumed within that negative unity. So, but the chemical process itself is not reducible to the neutral product, the tranquil neutrality that it produces. Here's what Hegel says about this. He's talking about the process, is still present. It's still there. It hasn't stopped, right? So just because you've got a neutral result doesn't mean the process is over with. That's the way we might think about it. Oh, it's done. But Hegel's point is actually it's not done. The process is still present, but has stepped outside. I emphasize that because there's apparently now the creation of something outside of the neutral concept. Outside the neutral object, which is resulting product. So at this stage, the process is inherently in tension with its abstraction. That is to say, with its product, what it's produced. Now, that's going to drive everything. Right? The process is not the product. The process is not the tranquil neutrality that it has produced. So what is chemical process? It's production of neutrality, resolving of all differences, but also the reinstilling of those differences on the other side. So it's the going together and falling apart. But if you just present it that way, you haven't given real significance to the going apart. So at this stage, the process is inherently in tension with its abstraction, its product. And as a result, the process itself breaks up, dissolves, disrupts. Let's use a loaded term because that's where Hegel's going to go with it. Negates the tranquil neutrality of the dissolved unity. So the breaking up of the dissolved unity, the dissolved neutrality, is not something that happens because the objects do it. The objects are done. The objects are all at peace, equilibrium, the chemical level. They're all done. They're all gone into, if you want to put it in chemical terms, they've all gone into solution. So what dissolves them back out? What rips them back out of this dissolved moment? The process does. Because the process disrupts that unity, because that process is not, that product is not what the process truly is. So the process's negating of its own product is, however, not just the disruption, it is that, but it's not just the disruption of the tranquil neutrality, that is, of its product, that it has produced, but it is also the differentiating generation of the base and the catalyst. This is Hegel's, the last page and a half, of the chemism analysis. This is really what he's trying to convey there, as far as I can tell. And I grant you, nowhere on those pages is he very clear about this. So I've been through those pages numerous times in German and in English, trying to say, oh, what went through here? It's very hard to make heads or tails. But at the end of the day, this is what I've become convinced of that he's doing there, because of what he does with the syllogisms summarizing. So this is really reading back the syllogisms back into what he's doing there. We'll come to those in a moment. So consequently, what we learn at that point is that the disruption is not just a breaking up of the neutrality, it's the engendering of the moments of the neutrality itself, the objects and their particularity. So if you just kind of step back out at this moment, you'll say, oh, wait a minute. I thought the universality, if we're going to do universality, particularity, and singularity, I thought the singularity is the object. Good. The particularity is they want to stand on their own. That's fine. And the universality is their self-subsistence. It's the tranquil unity. Yeah, that's the way that works. But Hegel's point is that no, actually, the singularity is the object. Right about that. The particularity is not the self-subsistence they all share, but it's the product that's been produced by the tranquil neutrality that they all have been dissolved into. That's the particularity. That's the particularity they all share. That's a particular universal. Right? Particular universal is used that. And what's the true universal? What's the objective, determinate universal? Is the process itself. So consequently, by virtue of its negativity, the chemical process produces the objects qua chemical in tension with one another, with which the account began. So everything has been engendered by, created by, produced by that process itself. So what we thought was initially, and it is in the mechanical layer, set of objects that are caught up into a process. And in the chemical layer, a process that is brought about by the objects, being the agents of it. It turns out that the process, which began with the striving that self-contradiction of each object has, that striving, that process is actually what generates, creates, produces the objects and the negative unity itself, the base and the genus. Now, if that makes a little bit of sense, then when he says, as he does, this is on page 649, so take a look at me at the horrendous page of 649. Take a look in particular, I'm going to back up one. If you look at 648, you see him right here. This is on the first full paragraph down. The more precise immediate connection of the extreme of negative unity with the object is in that the latter is determined by it and is thereby disrupted. So that whole account is him saying, this is a disruption that's going on. The process is disrupting the actual product that it has produced. So, now that we've reached this negative unity, this neutrality, we're breaking that up, or it's being broke up. But then he starts to lay it out and says, well, how did that actually work? And he says, it's because this process has at its core a middle, right, that's engendering both moments. So that leads him to say in the next paragraph down, this disjunctive syllogism, you can think about this as, he's literally saying, the chemical dimension of reality is a disjunctive syllogism. This disjunctive syllogism is the totality of chemism in which the same objective whole is exhibited as self-standing negative unity, then in the middle term as real unity, and finally as the chemical reality resolved into its abstract moments. In these moments, the determinateness has not reached its immanent reflection in an other, as in the neutral product, but it has in itself returned into its abstraction an originally determined element. So it's generated itself out of itself. It didn't reflect into another to do that. It's not reaching a product and thereby resolving itself. in this product, reflecting into another, it's actually generating that out of itself. The process engenders its own presuppositions, its own moments. Then look at what he says in the next paragraph down. We find this incredibly, incredibly important, incredibly interesting. These chemical objects are therefore liberated, freed from, literally, the chemical tension. In them, the original basis of that presupposition with which chemism began has been posited through the real process. So now where we began has been posited, been produced by the process itself. Now further, this interdeterminateness is as such essentially the contradiction of their simple indifferent subsistence in themselves as determinateness. So he's recalling you for, he's walking you back through the argument. And it is the outward impulse, trieb. Right? So we moved from streben to talk about trieb, impulse, urge, you could say. But now it's an impulse and urge that's in the process itself, not just in the object, but it's in the process itself. He says, and is the outward impulse that disrupts itself. It's outward because it stepped outside the product. So it disrupts itself, right? And posits tension, produces tension. So now it's producing that which it presupposed in its determined object and in an other, in order that the object may have something to which it can relate as non-indifferent. So it creates literally the tensed world of the chemical layer that we began with. This process does, with which it can neutralize itself. So now it can come into subsumption with one another into this neutral element, this neutral product, with which it can neutralize itself and give to its simple determinateness an existent reality. Consequently, on the one hand, chemism has gone back to its beginning. We got back to tension, in which objects in a state of reciprocal tension seek one another and then combine in a neutral product by means of a formal and external middle term. And on the other hand, so we've now got an account of how the chemical layer of reality operates. It's because this process, which only came on the scene last, turns out to have actually produced the products, produced both the objects, produces their tension, and produces their product. They collapse and neutralize one another. He says, and on the other hand, so that's the account of chemism, but then he says, last line here, and on the other hand, by thus going back to its concept, here's now the concept at work, chemism sublates itself and has gone over into a higher sphere. Now, I read 649 over to 650 to be an explication of that last claim. How in the world does chemism sublate itself, given what we've just seen? And he then proceeds 349 to 350 to lay out these three syllogisms to try to explain them. Now, I don't want to go through each one of the syllogisms. I want to focus on the last one for reasons that will be fairly obvious in just a moment. But are everyone sort of okay up to this point? So, one half of that top line on 649 is just to say, now we know why the chemical world's like it is, right? The chemical layer of reality, the chemical layer of objectivity is an intrinsically opposed set of objects because they are all products of a process that puts them in those conditions with respect to one another. That's the big. They're not caught up in a process. The process is not just the result of their tension with one another either. The process literally is what creates all through its differentiation. That's why it's a disjunctive syllogism. Its universality is the middle term. Universality generates its specifications. That's what it's just done. So he says there's a triad of syllogisms here that defines chemism. The first syllogism is about the chemical object. It's about inherence again. The second syllogism is about the chemical process. Here, the chemical process where things all are subsumed. They all come together in this tranquil neutrality. But then look at the third syllogism. This is again about the chemical process, but now not the chemical process insofar as it creates tension and lets them all be neutralized, but insofar as it actually generates all, and therefore is not just them anymore. It's, let's use a loaded term, separable from them, which is exactly what Hegel's about to say. So the middle term here is the self-realizing concept. It's the third figure, it's determination, where universality is the middle between singularity and particularity. The extremes are the presuppositions for the realization of the concept. So it's about singularity, it's about the objects, it's about particularity, it's about the neutral product that's produced out of them, it's the negative unity. So look at how in 649, this is in the bottom of 649, quoting from Yeah. Trying to match my translation with what yeah. So it's actually over on 650. I'm sorry, it's a bit misleading. I said it's 649 and 650 here. It's 650 and it's the third line down, but the two essential moments of the process. Everybody see where I'm at? 650 in the translation, 153 in the German. He writes this, the two essential moments of the process. Neutralization on the one hand. So that's the coming together of all things in this product. And dissolution and reduction on the other. So there's the coming out of that neutrality, all not being subsumed under the oneness of it. He says, since they two are bound together in one and the same process, so it's one and the same process doing both things, and the union, blunting the tension of the extremes, is also a separation. So what brings them together is also what separates them back out into these, constitute on account of the still underlying externality two diverse sides. So you still get two sides. You get the objects and you get the neutrality they can go into. And so far as the former proceed from it again as non-indifferent, they must turn outwards. Their renewed neutralization is a process other than the one that took place in the first. So now, what's happened? Well, this process is now said, okay, the process itself is distinct from the neutralization that takes place, particularity. It's also distinct from the objects that are in tension with one another, the singularities. So if you look at the transition now, on the page 6, last page, I'm trying to capture this transition in terms of the syllogism in this way. Hegel claims that the externality of the mutually non-indifferent extremes, defined by the contradiction between the concept in itself and its self-realization, that is, in shorthand, chemical objects qua striving, is sublated in the first syllogism because it's about inherence. It's about how that self-subsistence inheres in each object. But in the second syllogism, it's about subsumption, right? Because each one inheres, that feature inheres in all of them, then it's what subsumes them all together, what gives them the affinity, what brings them all together, and the neutral product at the end. So there's the externality of the real unity, the tranquil neutrality as dissolved product is sublated. And finally, in the third syllogism, here is SUP, where the U is concrete or objective universality. The externality, the entire abstract external immediacy is sublated. So all that's now become generated out of the concept, because the concept is that process. But notice what that means. In the end, then, in chemism, objective universality is shown to sublate and posit the tensed objects, their dissolved unity, and the entire abstract immediacy. All of that's been produced by the concept. All that's been produced, and that's all there is. So all that's been produced by the concept. So now, little by little, the concept is standing over against what it has produced, literally everything else. So the concept qua process, standing over against it. The presuppositions of chemism are thus shown to be posited by the chemical process. Chemical objects are not caught up in the chemical process they are produced by. Hence, by virtue of this, the concept has liberated itself from objective externality. It was submerged in it, into being in and for itself. And now, being in and for itself, objectivity, mechanism and chemism as layers, stand over against the concept, because the concept has proven to be that which engenders all of that. The concept thus now stands over against objectivity, and objectivity in turn exists for the sake of, there's the teleological instrumental relationship, for the sake of the concept. Here's the way he puts it. This is on 650. This is 5 lines up from the bottom. This is 153 still in the German. The concept that has sublated as external all the moments of its objective existence. So the concept, this process that has generated everything else that is, both mechanistically and chemistically, and has posited them in its simple unity, is thereby completely freed from. So I know it's 100 pages earlier, but this is where Hegel was saying that which is submerged has got to emerge out of it. The concept that is submerged into objectivity qua being in and for itself has got to show itself to be intrinsic to all those moments, mechanism and chemism, but also rise out as distinct from them, as being the cause, the generator of all those things. The concept that has sublated as external all the moments of its objective existence and has posited them in its simple unity is thereby completely freed from the objective externality to which it relates only as an unessential reality. Now, we know where he goes after that. He's going to say, well, this is Vec, right? This is purpose, this is the end. But stay with it for just a moment, right? That's him saying literally, the concept is now stepped out over against objectivity, where objectivity now is an unessential reality. It does not exist on its own. That's what unessential here means, right? It doesn't exist on its own anymore. It's not in and for itself. It's an immediate existence. It exists for the sake of something else. What's that something else? The concept. That's what the concept is shown. There would be no mechanical dimension, there would be no chemical dimension without the work we've just seen of the concept doing what it does. So I take it that this is Hegel saying, okay, I told you the concept is submerged in objectivity and in for itself. I've shown you that it is. But being submerged means that it's there. We'll talk about exactly how it was there all along, but it's been there, right? It was the processes of communication and distribution in the mechanical. It was the process of communication, but also disruption, the catalyst in the chemical dimension. And that didn't, in the chemical, that didn't just put everything back together, right? It's not as though everything flowed into one another in the communication at the chemical level and everything, became rest and equilibrium. It does do that, right? But it's not just that when it disrupts it. The disruption is a negation that's not just blowing everything to smithereens. This is Hegel always saying, I know it looks like abstract negativity, but it's determinate negation. That's what's going on. It doesn't blow the thing to bits. It's actually what appears to be disrupting the tranquil unity and blowing everything to bits. My paraphrase, nowhere to be found in Hegel's, and I'm looking for it. It is not just blowing everything to bits, it's engendering all the bits. It's what makes all objects qua chemical be what they are and be in tension with all the other objects so that they can go back into neutrality again and then be disrupted again so that they are separable. This objective free concept, notice this is the first time he's called it this, right? This objective, so it's out there. It's no longer a subjective concept. It's not a formal concept. This isn't the concept qua, we haven't reverted back all of a sudden to the concept qua judgment or the concept qua syllogism or, my God, the concept qua conceptual determinations. This is an objective concept. We just spent a lot of time showing that the concept is actually in things themselves. It's in the world. It's in being. It's in essence, to put it in a slightly different language. But that concept's now free. Well, what does free mean here? I would submit that free doesn't yet mean self-causative. The most he said at this point is the concept has freed itself from, right? Liberated itself, emancipated itself, right? Freed itself from objectivity. And now it stands in a relationship of, roughly speaking, the producer of what is produced. That's where we're at. So the free concept here means that it's no longer beholden to and submerged within objectivity as being in and for itself. But it doesn't yet mean what it will eventually come to mean, which is full freedom, which is freedom as self-causative. So I read the teleology chapter. All that's built up to talk about that. I read the teleology chapter as trying to grapple with that question of freedom. How can the concept, which is now the Zweck, the purpose, the end, towards which everything that exists, exists, for the sake of which everything exists, exists. So Hegel is clearly saying, at this moment in objectivity, we're talking about immediate existence, and immediate existence stands at the behest, to put it in caricatured language, at the behest of the concept. The concept rules. Right? The concept rules everything. And therefore, we rightly picture this, right, at least initially, as a relationship between the concept and immediate existence, as a relationship of violence. We haven't had to use that language up until this point. We used it a little bit when we talked about how the objects, resist distribution in the mechanical phase, but ultimately their resistance is futile. Right? They are undermined by the very power of distribution itself. Mach overtakes DePaul. But here in teleology, the concept is everything has supreme status, and everything is literally at its behest. It exists for the sake of it. And I think it's always wise to read Hegel as literally as possible. What he is saying here, he means what he says here, that everything exists for the sake of, everything exists for the sake of the concept. Why? Because the concept has shown, not just because the concept walked in and said, by the way, you all work for me now. Okay? Because it's earned this title. And it's earned this title, it's earned this status by virtue of showing through mechanism and chemism that there is no mechanical objects and mechanical process, there is no chemical objects and chemical process, the layers, both those layers. There is none of that stuff unless the concept does what it does. So it was buried in there, but now it's been rendered explicit, and its work is entitled it to this position. So when we say that it's that, when we say that it's the purpose, as it gets translated in this translation, I'm not against the translation, it's fine. So I'll just say purpose or end, I'll mean the same thing, it's Vec. Say the concept is Vec is not to say, oh, there's some, being who's arrived, God, humanity, whatever, that has a goal that it's pursuing, and that's what the concept is. Our goal, God's goal, somebody's goal. When he says that this is, the concept is the Vec, he doesn't think of it intentionally. It's not something that is asserted by a will, whether ours or God's. It's not something that is born within things and is directing all things. This is not the entelechy of Leibniz, not the entelechy of Aristotle. He's saying it's something unto itself, and everything that exists at its behest, at its usage. Everything exists for the sake of. So instrumentality, you want to know what makes mechanism and chemism possible, according to Hegel, instrumentality does. Because they're all at the behest, mechanical and chemical dimensions are all at the behest of the concept. Because the concept has proven itself to be their producer. To use a more loaded language, their creator. We good? Make some sense? And that's kind of crazy, let's be clear, right? But as I think exactly what Hegel's claiming. So when he says at that moment at the end of chemism, when he says the concept has freed itself, and now we're talking about the objective free concept, he's saying it's